The desert wind howled like an ancient scream across the Mongolian plains. The night was alive with firelight, not from torches of celebration, but from execution pits dug into the earth. Witnesses said the air itself trembled when Genghis Khan entered. He didn't walk like a man. He moved like a force of nature, silent, calculating, eyes that saw everything and forgave nothing. In front of him knelt the leaders of a conquered tribe, proud men only hours ago, now stripped, bound, and trembling before a king who believed mercy was weakness. No judge. No jury, only his word, and that was law. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a message. Some were boiled alive in cauldrons of tar. Others were crushed beneath wooden gates while their families were forced to watch. The screams carried miles into the night. But to the Khan, they were instruments of order, sounds of obedience being carved into the bones of nations. He once said, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." But the truth behind those words was far darker than any history book dares to show, because the conquests were only half the story. The real terror wasn't what he built. It was what he did after victory: hidden chambers, unrecorded tortures, and a system of fear so brutal it vanished from most chronicles, erased by those who couldn't bear to remember it. And tonight, we're going to uncover what Genghis Khan never wanted the world to know. Before he was the great Khan, before the world trembled at his name, Temüjin was just a boy in exile, starving, betrayed, and hunted across the Mongolian steppe. Born into a fractured world of warring tribes, he witnessed the law of survival at its purest and most savage. When his father was poisoned by a rival clan, the boy was abandoned by his own people. No fire, no food, no future. That was where the seed of Genghis Khan was planted, not in glory, but in humiliation. For years, Temüjin roamed the plains, surviving on roots, frozen meat, and hatred. He learned that power was not given, it was taken, and mercy was just another form of weakness. Every betrayal hardened him. Every loss shaped him. By the time he rose from obscurity to unite the Mongol tribes, he had already shed everything human about himself. The 12th century world he inherited was cruel, but his response to it was something else entirely. To forge unity, he ruled with terror as his language, not faith, not diplomacy. Villages that resisted were wiped from the map. Entire populations vanished overnight. Cities that refused tribute became graves of dust. His empire stretched farther than any before him, from China's Great Wall to the heart of Eastern Europe. But behind the staggering scale of his conquest was a machinery of fear few could imagine. Captured generals were executed in creative ways meant to erase their legacy. Nobles were crushed beneath the weight of their own people. He used terror not as revenge, but as a calculated system of control. And yet, for all the blood and brutality recorded by chroniclers, many accounts were silenced, edited, or destroyed. Mongol scribes who documented the inner workings of Khan's punishment system often disappeared. Even foreign diplomats who entered his courts returned with fragmented memories, tales they refused to repeat. Because what lay inside his camps was not warfare. It was ritualized torment, not chaos, but discipline through horror. And as his power grew, so did the scale of cruelty, until even his most loyal commanders began to fear the man they called the eternal blue skies chosen. What began as one man's hunger for survival had turned into an empire that devoured the world one body at a time. History remembers Genghis Khan as the unstoppable storm of the East, a man who shaped the world with nothing but willpower and fire. But behind the victories and the legends was something darker, something that didn't live in the battlefield, but in the human mind. Once the tribes united under his banner, Khan faced a new challenge, one not how to win, but how to control. He didn't want loyalty built on love or gratitude. He wanted obedience built on fear, because fear never questions, fear obeys. His empire ran on a code, the Yasa, a law so strict it turned whispers into weapons. Every person, from soldier to noble, lived under its shadow. One mistake could mean disgrace. One doubt could mean disappearance. And slowly, fear became the language of the empire, No one dared to lie. No one dared to disobey because no one knew who was watching. He ruled through mystery, a presence so vast that even his silence carried weight. When he rode into a conquered city, people fell to their knees not from command, but from the aura of inevitability. It was as if the universe itself had bent to his will. He understood something timeless, that the mind breaks long before the body. He learned to command thoughts, not just armies. His name alone could end a rebellion before it. Began stories of his vengeance spread across continents, stories so terrifying that no one dared to check if they were true. And that's where his true genius lived, not in the sword, but in the story. He let fear do the ruling for him. Generals who failed vanished from records. Cities that resisted were erased not by destruction, but by silence, their names never spoken again. To be forgotten under Genghis Khan was the deepest punishment of all. People began to believe he wasn't just a man, but a force of nature, a storm sent by the heavens to cleanse the world of weakness. Even his allies feared to stand too close. What made Genghis different wasn't cruelty. It was calculation. Every decision, every order, every rumor, all designed to craft one idea, that resistance was impossible. He didn't just build an empire of land, he built an empire of the mind. And that empire, of silence, awe and obedience, lasted long after the blood had dried and the swords had rusted, because long after a conqueror dies, the fear of his memory keeps ruling. Every empire is built on power. But Genghis Khan discovered something deeper, something invisible, something that no wall, no sword, no army could ever match. It wasn't fear alone. It was control through belief. Historians often speak of his tactics, his speed, his unmatched military brilliance. But what they rarely discuss is the system beneath the system, the silent machinery that kept millions of people obedient without constant war. It began with a principle. If the people believe the Khan sees all, then he doesn't need to watch them. He constructed a legend so vast, so untouchable, that it became reality. Messengers carried his commands across continents, but what they really carried was his presence. Every decree began with a line that chilled the soul. By the eternal blue sky, and by the Khan who sees through all lies. Imagine living under that sentence. Imagine knowing that your ruler didn't just command soldiers and he commanded truth itself. Even when he wasn't there, people acted as though he was. Every marketplace, every home, every whispered conversation became a place where the Khan might be listening. No statue, no portrait, just the idea. The shadow of a man who might be watching. And that idea ruled far longer than he ever could. But there was something else. Something historians found only centuries later, buried in old Mongol chronicles. A secret network of watchers, not spies in the modern sense, but witnesses. Ordinary citizens, chosen to observe and report those who betrayed the Khan's order. They weren't soldiers. They were neighbors, a baker, a herdsman, a monk. Their loyalty bought not with gold, but with the illusion of proximity to the Khan himself. They believed they served the eternal will, not a man, but destiny. That's how he built the unbreakable circle. Belief created obedience. Obedience created order. Order sustained the belief. It was a cycle that turned ordinary people into guardians of his empire, even against their own will. And through it all, the Khan's image grew stranger, darker, more divine. Some said he spoke with the sky. Some said he dreamed of every battle before it began. And others whispered that he had no shadow at all, that he was part of the wind, always moving, never seen. The truth is simpler and far more chilling. He understood what every ruler since has tried to imitate, that the greatest weapon in history is faith and fear. By the end of his life, the Mongol Empire stretched farther than any before it. But what truly held it together wasn't conquest. It was belief. People didn't just fear Genghis Khan. They believed he was inevitable. And that, in the end, is the deepest kind of power a human can hold. Because when a leader becomes larger than life, even death cannot remove them from the world they've shaped. When Genghis Khan died, most expected his empire to die with him. No one man could possibly hold together the largest land empire in history, but somehow it did, not through bloodlines or treaties, but through fear organized into faith. His successors didn't need to invent new systems. They simply inherited the invisible machinery he built, a culture that associated obedience with survival and loyalty with divine order. Across Asia and Eastern Europe, his name carried a weight unlike any other. Cities surrendered at the mention of it. Armies fled without seeing a single Mongol rider, even in lands he had never reached. Kings built fortifications in case the Khan returns. He became more myth than man, a phantom that haunted strategy, tables and royal councils for centuries. But the legacy wasn't just military, it was psychological. In many conquered regions, people adapted to the Mongol idea of power, the notion that order could be born from absolute control. Local rulers, even after independence, copied the Mongol system. Information flowed upward, punishment downward. Loyalty was measured not in virtue, but in silence. It changed how governments saw people, not as citizens, but as resources to manage. It changed how leaders understood fear, not as chaos, but as a tool of administration. And it changed how entire generations learned to survive, by watching what they said, by never trusting too deeply, by accepting that power existed beyond morality. Centuries later, the same principle resurfaced, not on horseback, but in offices and courtrooms. The modern world often believes it's far removed from medieval cruelty, but the structure remains hauntingly similar. Instead of swords, there are policies. Instead of open threats, there is quiet pressure. Instead of public executions, there are social, economic, or digital punishments, all designed to maintain control without appearing to use force. It's the same formula Genghis Khan understood. If people fear losing what they have, they will rarely question the one who gives it. His empire dissolved in borders, but not in thought. Every empire that came after, from the Ottomans to the British, studied his methods, sometimes without realizing it. Control through narrative, discipline through terror, expansion through myth. Even in modern geopolitics, echoes of his system remain. Propaganda, surveillance, psychological warfare, all rely on the same idea that fear is cheaper than violence. It costs less to terrify a population than to fight it. It's more efficient to convince people they're being watched than to actually watch them. The Mongols learned that in the 13th century, and the world in its own ways never stopped using it. The ultimate consequence of Genghis Khan's rule wasn't just an empire. It was a blueprint for domination, a method so effective that it outlived its creator, its culture, even its memory. Because long after his bones turned to dust, his greatest invention survived: the belief that fear, properly managed, can make men obey forever. History books often end Genghis Khan's story with numbers: the miles conquered, the cities burned, the millions dead. But those figures miss something deeper. They don't capture what was left behind in the human mind. Long after his empire fell, the lands he ruled still carried the invisible imprint of control. In some places, entire cultures learned to whisper instead of speak. Generations grew up believing that silence was safety, that obedience was wisdom, that questioning authority was a kind of suicide. That is the truest legacy of Genghis Khan. Not the bones buried in the steppe, not the banners that crumbled in the dust, but the way he reshaped the psychology of fear itself. He didn't just conquer nations, he conquered the human instinct for defiance. He turned the terror of one lifetime into a memory that could pass through bloodlines. Look closely at the world today, and you still see his reflection, not in faces or flags, but in behavior. Whenever power demands silence, whenever truth becomes dangerous, whenever the powerful rewrite their cruelty as necessity, the shadow of the Khan returns. It's no longer about horses or arrows, it's about control that no longer needs chains, because people build them for themselves. Maybe that's why his burial site was kept secret, because what he built was never meant to be buried. It was meant to live on, quietly, invisibly, in the way humanity governs itself. The armies are gone. The screams are silent. But the idea remains, and that fear can rule where reason cannot. And that idea, born on the Mongolian steppe 800 years ago, still rides across the world today, unseen, unending, unstoppable. Centuries have passed, yet the shadow of Genghis Khan still lingers, not in the monuments, nor in the stories of conquest, but in the silence of those who remembered what it truly cost. We celebrate his victories, call him a military genius, a man who reshaped the world with fire and blood. But beneath every legend lies a truth we were never meant to see. The price of power, paid in whispers, fear, and forgotten lives. History tells us he united empires. But what if unity was just another name for control? What if the loyalty he commanded was born not from respect, but from terror? The chronicles of his empire are incomplete for a reason. Pages were lost, erased, rewritten, perhaps not to protect him, but to protect us from what we might find. So I'll leave you with this. Do you believe history buried his cruelty to preserve his legend, or to shield humanity from its reflection?